The encounter. The silence was deafening. Ilara crouched low in the dark, cold cave, her back pressed against the jagged wall. Her breaths came quick and shallow, her chest rising and falling as she tried to stay quiet. Outside, the alien world was alive with danger. Glowing plants whispered in the wind, and strange, distant roars sent shivers down her spine. She had been running for hours, her body aching, her mind racing with fear. The crash of her escape pod had drawn them, the creatures of this world. She hadn't seen them clearly, but she'd heard their growls and seen their shadows flickering in the dim, green light of the alien moon. She knew they were hunting her. Alone on an unknown planet, survival was her only goal. Ilara clenched her broken communicator in her hand. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath. It was useless, just like her emergency beacon. No one was coming for her. No one even knew she was alive. She froze. A faint sound reached her ears, like footsteps. Not the heavy, guttural thuds of the predators, but something lighter, more deliberate. She held her breath, her fingers trembling as she gripped the sharp metal shard she'd salvaged from the pod. It wasn't much, but it was the only weapon she had. Then she saw him. A tall figure emerged from the shadows at the entrance of the cave. His form was humanoid but not entirely human. His skin glowed faintly, a soft silver-blue hue that made him almost seem like a ghost. His eyes were bright, like molten gold, and they locked onto hers instantly. Ilara's heart skipped a beat. She scrambled backward, her makeshift blade raised defensively. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice echoing through the cave. The alien didn't move. He stood still, his head tilting slightly as if studying her. He was unlike anything she had ever seen, his presence both terrifying and strangely mesmerizing. He wore what looked like armor, sleek and black, with faintly glowing symbols etched across it. His hands were empty, but the air around him seemed to hum with energy. Ilara's mind raced. Who was he? What did he want? Could he be one of them, the creatures hunting her? No, he was different. He didn't have their monstrous growls or their wild, erratic movements. He seemed calm, almost curious. "I said stay back," she repeated, her voice shaking. The alien finally moved. Slowly, he raised his hands, palms facing her, a universal gesture of peace. Then he reached to his chest and pressed a small device. A moment later, a voice spoke, smooth, deep, and slightly mechanical. It wasn't his voice, but the device translating his words. "I mean no harm." Ilara blinked, her grip on the blade faltering. She hadn't expected him to speak, let alone communicate in her language. What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The alien pointed toward the mouth of the cave. "Danger," he said simply. His golden eyes flickered, his gaze shifting toward the darkness outside. "They come." Her blood ran cold. "What do you mean? Who's coming?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements fluid but deliberate. Ilara tightened her grip on the blade, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her legs refused to move. Something about him kept her rooted in place. "Predators," he said finally. "They smell fear. They hunt both of us." Ilara's heart pounded in her chest. "Both of us," she repeated. "You mean they're hunting you too?" The alien nodded. "Your arrival disturbed the balance. They are drawn to your energy." His eyes narrowed slightly. "If we stay, we die." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had known she was in danger, but hearing it spoken so plainly made it real. She glanced toward the entrance of the cave, her mind racing. Could she trust him? He didn't look like the monsters she'd been running from, but that didn't mean he wasn't dangerous. The alien took another step closer. "Come," he said, holding out a hand to her. His voice, though monotone through the device, held a strange urgency. "We must leave." Ilara stared at his hand, her instincts at war with her logic. Trusting him could mean walking into a trap, but staying here was certain death. Her grip on the blade loosened as her fear began to shift into something else. Desperation. A loud guttural roar shattered the silence, echoing from somewhere deep in the forest outside. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, and her stomach twisted in terror. Whatever was out there was getting closer. The alien didn't flinch. His glowing eyes remained fixed on her, his hand still extended. "Now," he said, his voice firm. Ilara made her decision. She reached out and grabbed his hand. The moment their fingers touched, a strange warmth spread through her. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was unsettling. She didn't have time to dwell on it, though. The alien pulled her to her feet and led her toward the cave entrance. "Stay close," he said as they stepped into the eerie, glowing forest. The sounds of the predators grew louder, their growls and snarls cutting through the night like knives. Ilara didn't look back. She couldn't. All she could do was follow the alien, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind screaming with questions. Who was he? What was he? And most importantly, could she survive this strange new world by trusting him? The answers would have to wait. Right now, survival was all that mattered. Trust or trap. The forest around them buzzed with an eerie electric energy. The faint bioluminescence of alien plants cast a greenish glow, creating strange shadows that danced and flickered as if alive. Ilara followed closely behind the alien, her hand still tingling from where it had touched his. The warmth she felt earlier hadn't faded, and it unnerved her. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion. The alien didn't answer immediately. He moved with swift precision, his golden eyes scanning the surroundings. Every now and then, he'd pause, tilting his head as if listening to something only he could hear. His silence grated on her nerves. "I ask you a question," Ilara said, louder this time. She stopped abruptly, gripping the shard of metal tighter. "I'm not taking another step until you tell me where we're going and why I should trust you." The alien turned to face her, his glowing eyes narrowing slightly. "Trust," he repeated, the mechanical translation from his device adding an unnatural echo to the word. "Trust is irrelevant. Survival is not." Ilara clenched her jaw. "That's not good enough. For all I know, you're leading me straight to those predators, or worse." For the first time, the alien's expression shifted. His brow furrowed, and he seemed almost offended. "If I wanted you dead, human, you would be dead," he said bluntly. The words sent a chill down her spine. She hated how calm he sounded, as though her life was a trivial matter to him. But his statement also rang true. If he'd meant to harm her, he'd had plenty of chances by now. "Fine," she muttered, glancing nervously at the dark trees around them. "Then what's your plan?" He stepped closer, towering over her. "The predators track energy," he explained. "Your presence, your fear, radiates like a beacon. They will not stop until they catch you. To survive, you must learn to hide." Ilara's eyes narrowed. "Hide? From things that can smell fear? That's your big plan?" The alien tilted his head again, this time with a hint of impatience. "It is not simple. The forest has currents, energy flows. If we move correctly, we can mask your presence." Before she could respond, a distant roar split the air, deeper and more guttural than the others she'd heard. This one sounded closer, too close. The alien's eyes snapped to the direction of the sound. "They are near," he said. "We must move now." "No," Ilara said firmly, stepping back. "Not until you tell me your name." The alien blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "Name," he repeated, almost confused. "Yes, your name," Ilara insisted. "I'm not running through some alien forest with a stranger who won't even tell me his name." After a moment of hesitation, he replied, "Edrix." Ilara nodded, satisfied for now. "All right, Edrix. Lead the way." The moment the words left her mouth, Edrix spun around and started moving again, his pace quick and deliberate. Ilara followed, trying to ignore the ominous noises growing louder behind them. As they navigated the twisting paths of the forest, Ilara couldn't help but notice how Adrix seemed to blend seamlessly with his surroundings. His movements were precise, his body almost becoming one with the strange, glowing terrain. "How do you know so much about these predators?" she asked, struggling to keep up. Adrix didn't look back as he answered, "My people have faced them for centuries. They are creatures of instinct, driven by hunger and drawn to energy. We learned to evade them long ago." "Your people?" Ilara pressed. "Are they nearby? Can they help us?" Adrix hesitated for the briefest moment, but it was enough for Ilara to catch. "They are gone," he said quietly. The weight of his words hung in the air, and Ilara didn't push further. The way he said it made her think there was more to the story, but now wasn't the time. Suddenly, Adrix stopped, holding up a hand to silence her. Ilara froze, her heart pounding as she strained to hear what had caught his attention. Then she heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something massive moving through the underbrush. It was followed by a low growl that made her stomach twist in fear. Adrix turned to her, his voice sharp and urgent. "Stay close to me. Do not run." Before she could respond, the creature emerged from the shadows. It was massive, its sleek, black body glistening with a strange, oily sheen. Its eyes glowed a sickly green, and its sharp, clawed limbs moved with terrifying grace. Ilara's breath caught in her throat as the predator fixed its gaze on them, its growl deepening. "Do not show fear," Adrix whispered, his voice steady despite the danger. Ilara wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there frozen. The predator took a step closer, its claws scraping against the ground. And then, to her horror, Adrix stepped forward, placing himself between her and the creature. His glowing eyes burned brighter as he raised his hand, and the air around him began to shimmer. "What are you doing?" Ilara hissed. "Buying us time," he replied. A sudden burst of light shot from Adrix's hand, creating a barrier of energy between them and the predator. The creature recoiled, snarling in fury, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it circled the barrier, testing its strength. "Ilara," Adrix said, his voice strained. "When I say run, you run. Do not look back. But run." Before she could argue, the barrier flickered, and Adrix lunged at the creature, drawing its attention away from her. Ilara's instincts screamed at her to stay and help, but she knew she'd only get in the way. With one last glance at Adrix, she turned and ran, her heart pounding as the sounds of their battle faded behind her. Trust or trap? She still wasn't sure. But in that moment, she chose to trust him. The chase. The ground beneath her feet trembled, as if the forest itself was alive, and warning her to flee. Ilara's lungs burned as she ran, weaving through the alien foliage, her heartbeat pounding louder than the distant snarls behind her. She could still see Adrix's glowing form in her mind, standing firm against the predator as he shouted for her to run. Now she was alone, and every step felt like it brought her closer to death. The forest was a maze of glowing vines and towering trees that seemed to twist and bend unnaturally. The air crackled with energy, static brushing against her skin. Ilara stumbled over a root, falling hard onto the soft, mossy ground. She groaned, scrambling to her feet, but the sound of heavy footsteps behind her made her freeze. Turning her head slightly, she caught a glimpse of a shadow, long, spindly limbs, and glowing green eyes, moving between the trees. They were close. Too close. Ilara's breath hitched. She grabbed a sharp rock from the ground, clutching it tightly. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Before she could move, a low growl echoed from her left, then another from her right. Her stomach dropped. There wasn't just one predator. There were two. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, trying to still her trembling hands. But it was impossible to ignore the primal fear surging through her veins. The predators emerged from the shadows, their sleek black bodies shimmering faintly under the bioluminescent light. Their clawed feet crushed the soft moss with ease, and their glowing green eyes locked onto her. Elara stepped back, her chest heaving. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she knew she wouldn't make it far. These creatures were too fast, too agile. Suddenly, the air around her seemed to shift, growing colder. A faint hum filled her ears, and a burst of light erupted behind her. Elara. She spun around to see Adrix, his golden eyes blazing like fire. His armor was cracked, and a dark, shimmering substance dripped from his arm. His blood, she realized with a jolt. "I told you to run," he said, stepping between her and the predators. "I did." She shot back, panic creeping into her voice. "They followed me." Adrix raised his hand, and the space around them shimmered as a glowing, translucent wall formed between them and the creatures. The predators snarled, clawing at the barrier, their sharp talons sparking against the energy. "You've made it worse," Adrix muttered, his voice laced with frustration. "I made it worse," Elara snapped, pointing at the predators. "You didn't exactly give me a manual on how to survive alien monsters." Adrix ignored her, his focus entirely on the barrier. The shimmering wall flickered, and Elara noticed his shoulders sagging, his breathing uneven. Whatever he was doing, it was taking a toll on him. "They're adapting," he said grimly. "What do you mean, adapting?" "These creatures are intelligent," Adrix explained, his voice strained. "They learn. They'll find a way through the barrier soon." Elara's stomach twisted. "Then what do we do?" Adrix didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at her, his golden eyes scanning her face as if weighing a decision. Finally, he spoke. "We run. Together this time." Before Elara could protest, the barrier shattered, the sound like glass breaking under pressure. The predators lunged forward with terrifying speed, their snarls echoing through the forest. Adrix grabbed her arm, his grip firm, but not painful. "Move." They bolted into the forest, dodging low-hanging branches and weaving between glowing trees. The predators were relentless, their growls and snapping jaws growing louder with every passing second. Adrix led the way, his movements precise and calculated. He seemed to sense the forest's energy, avoiding areas where the currents felt wrong. Elara struggled to keep up, her legs burning with every step. "This way," Adrix shouted, pulling her down a narrow path lined with shimmering blue vines. As they ran, the predators gained ground, their claws tearing through the underbrush. One of them leaped, its powerful legs propelling it through the air toward Elara. "Down," Adrix barked. Elara dropped to the ground just as a flash of energy shot from Adrix's hand, striking the predator midair. The creature screeched, crashing into the trees, but its companion didn't hesitate. "They won't stop," Adrix said, his voice grim. "We need to reach the rift." "The rift?" Elara asked, panting. "It's a tear in the energy currents," he explained. "They can't follow us there." "And where exactly is this rift?" "Not far," he said, though his tone didn't inspire confidence. Elara glanced over her shoulder, her heart sinking, as she saw the remaining predator closing in. It moved with terrifying precision, its glowing eyes locked on her. "Adrix, keep running." He interrupted, his voice sharp. The forest began to change around them. The air grew heavier, the glowing plants dimming as they approached a clearing. Elara could feel the shift, a strange hum vibrating through her body. "There." Adrix pointed toward a shimmering tear in the air, like a jagged crack in a pane of glass. The predator snarled, lunging one last time. Adrix turned, his hands glowing with energy as he faced the creature. "Go," he shouted. Elara hesitated for a split second before diving through the rift. The world around her exploded into light and sound. And then silence. When she turned back, Adrix was gone. Had he made it, or had he sacrificed himself to save her? The thought sent a cold chill through her, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. whatever lay on the other side of this rift. She wasn't out of danger yet. A fragile alliance. The silence on the other side of the rift was almost as unsettling as the chaos Ilara had just escaped. She landed hard on her knees, the cold, glassy surface beneath her reflecting faint, fractured light from an endless void above. The air here was heavier, charged with an unfamiliar energy that made her skin tingle. It felt alien, more alien than the glowing forest she had fled from. Ilara spun around, expecting Adrix to appear behind her, but the tear in the air was already closing. "Adrix," she called out, her voice echoing unnaturally in the void. Her chest tightened as the rift sealed with a sound like cracking ice, leaving no trace of him. She was alone. "No, no, no," she whispered, her pulse racing. How could he have stayed behind? He was her only guide in this nightmare, the only one who knew this world. She gripped her knees, trying to steady her breathing, but the overwhelming silence pressed down on her like a weight. Suddenly, the air shimmered, and a figure emerged. Adrix stumbled through what looked like a crack in reality, his glowing armor flickering erratically. He dropped to one knee, his golden eyes dim, his breath ragged. "Adrix." Ilara rushed to his side, hesitating only briefly before grabbing his arm to steady him. "You made it," he said, his voice weak but tinged with relief. "You nearly didn't." She shot back, anger and worry mixing in her tone. "What were you thinking, staying back like that?" "I was buying time," he said simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. Ilara rolled her eyes. "Well, next time don't. I can't survive this place without you." Adrix glanced at her, his golden eyes flickering back to life. "Noted," he said, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Ilara helped him to his feet, surprised by how heavy he felt. Whatever energy he had used to fend off the predator had drained him, and it was clear he wouldn't recover quickly. "Where are we?" she asked, scanning their strange surroundings. The ground beneath them was smooth and reflective, like polished obsidian, but it wasn't solid. With every step, it rippled slightly, as though they were walking on liquid glass. "The in-between," Adrix said, leaning on her for support. "In between what?" "Worlds," he replied. "This is a place of transition, a tear in the fabric of reality. The predators cannot follow here, but it is not safe." Ilara frowned. "Not safe? Then why bring us here?" "Because the alternative was death," Adrix said bluntly. She sighed, realizing he was right. Still, the unease in her stomach wouldn't go away. The void stretched endlessly in all directions, and the faint hum of energy in the air made her skin crawl. As they walked, Adrix's weight grew heavier against her. His steps faltered, and his breathing became labored. "You're not okay," Ilara said, her voice tinged with concern. "I will recover," he replied, though his voice lacked its usual strength. "The energy here is chaotic. It disrupts my kind." "Then we need to get out of here," she said firmly. Adrix nodded but didn't reply. Instead, he gestured toward a faint light in the distance. "There. That will take us to safety." Ilara squinted. The light was faint, flickering like a dying flame, but it was the only direction they had. She tightened her grip on Adrix's arm and began moving toward it, her footsteps sending ripples across the glassy surface. As they walked, a faint whisper reached her ears. Ilara stopped, glancing around. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Adrix tensed, his glowing eyes scanning the void. "Ignore it," he said sharply. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, as if calling her name. Ilara froze, her heart racing. "What is that?" "The rift's echoes," Adrix said. "Memories, fears, and regrets. This place feeds on them. Do not listen." Ilara swallowed hard, nodding as she forced herself to keep moving. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, forming words, fragments of her own thoughts, her own doubts. "You'll never survive this. He's just using you. You're weak. "Stop it," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. "Ilara." Adrix's voice snapped her back to reality. She hadn't realized she'd stopped moving, her eyes fixed on the endless void around her. "Sorry," she mumbled, forcing her feet to move again. They reached the flickering light, which seemed to pulse as they approached. Adrix reached out, his hand glowing faintly as he touched the light. The space around them rippled, and the light expanded, forming a doorway. "This will take us to a safer place," Adrix said, his voice stronger now. "But once we step through, there's no turning back." Ilara hesitated, glancing back at the endless void. "Like we have a choice," she said, giving him a small, determined nod. Together, they stepped through the doorway, leaving the in-between behind. What awaited them on the other side, Ilara didn't know. But for the first time since crashing onto this strange world, she felt a spark of hope. A fragile alliance had been forged between them. And for now, it was enough to keep her moving forward. The mark of connection. Ilara's eyes adjusted slowly to the dim, golden light of their new surroundings. The air here was warmer, heavier, as if infused with a strange energy that pressed against her skin. The ground was soft under her boots, covered in what looked like shimmering golden sand. Above, the sky was a swirling canvas of bronze and amber hues, broken only by cracks of light that seemed to flicker like distant lightning. She took a deep breath, the air tasting faintly metallic, and turned to Adrix. He stood a few steps away, his shoulders tense, his glowing eyes scanning the horizon. The faint cracks in his armor had faded, and he seemed steadier now, though exhaustion still lingered in his posture. "Where are we now?" Ilara asked, her voice low. "The crossing," Adrix replied, his tone somber. "A place between safe zones. It is temporary, but stable enough for us to rest." "Rest," she echoed, skepticism creeping into her voice. "This doesn't look like a place anyone would rest." Adrix turned to her, and for a moment, his golden eyes softened. "Appearances are deceptive here, but you are right to be cautious." Ilara crossed her arms, her gaze narrowing. "Cautious doesn't even cover it. You still haven't explained what's happening, why they're hunting me, why you're helping me." And she hesitated, her words faltering as she glanced at her arm. There it was again, the faint glow on her skin, a mark she didn't recognize. It shimmered faintly, as if alive, its golden light matching the hue of Adrix's eyes. "What is this?" she demanded, holding up her arm. "This wasn't here before I met you." Adrix's expression shifted, and for the first time, he looked genuinely uneasy. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the glowing mark. "The bond," he said softly. "The what?" "The bond," he repeated, his voice steadier now. "It is a connection, a link between two beings forged by proximity and survival. It is rare, but not unheard of." Ilara took a step back, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean, a bond? I didn't ask for this." "Neither did I," Adrix said, his tone sharp. "But it happened. The predators forced it. Your fear, your will to survive, and my actions to protect you. They merge, creating this." He gestured to her arm. Ilara stared at him, her mind racing. "What does it mean? What does it do?" Adrix hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "The bond links our energies. It allows us to sense each other, to share certain instincts. But it also means our fates are tied." "Tied how?" "If one of us dies," Adrix said, his voice heavy, "the other will too." Ilara's stomach dropped. "You're kidding." "I do not jest," Adrix said, his tone grim. "The bond is both a strength and a curse. It can protect us, but it also makes us vulnerable." Ilara ran a hand through her hair, pacing in the golden sand. "This just keeps getting better and better," she muttered. "So now I'm stuck with you. And if either of us screws up, we both die." "Essentially," Adrix replied, his calm demeanor infuriating. Great, she said, throwing up her hands. Just fantastic. Adrix stepped closer, his gaze steady. I understand your frustration, but this bond may be the only reason we survive. It is not something to fear, Ilara. It is something to use. Use? She asked, her voice sharp. How do you expect me to use something I don't understand? Adrix raised a hand, gesturing for her to be still. Close your eyes, he said. What? Close your eyes, he repeated, his tone firm but not unkind. Trust me. Ilara hesitated, every instinct screaming at her not to trust him. But something in his gaze, a strange mixture of confidence and vulnerability, made her comply. She closed her eyes, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. Breathe, Adrix said softly. Focus on the mark. Feel the energy. Ilara frowned but did as he said, her breaths steadying as she focused on the strange warmth radiating from her arm. At first, it was faint, like a distant hum. But then, it grew stronger, spreading through her body like a gentle current. I feel it, she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. Good, Adrix said. Now, focus on me, on my energy. Her brow furrowed, but she concentrated. Slowly, she became aware of something else, a presence just beyond her own, like a second heartbeat. It pulsed in time with hers, steady and strong. That's you, she said, her voice barely audible. Yes, Adrix replied. The bond connects us. It allows us to share strength, to sense each other's intent. Ilara opened her eyes, staring at him in amazement. This is insane. It is survival, Adrix said simply. Before she could respond, a deep, guttural sound echoed through the air, shattering the fragile moment. Ilara's heart raced as she turned toward the source of the noise, a faint ripple in the golden sand, followed by another, growing closer. They found us, Adrix said, his voice grim. How? Ilara asked, panic rising in her chest. The bond, Adrix replied. It shines like a beacon. They're drawn to it. Ilara stared at him, her mind spinning. The bond that had saved them might now lead to their doom. What do we do? She asked, gripping the glowing shard of metal at her side. We fight, Adrix said, stepping forward, his hands already beginning to glow. Together. And for the first time, Ilara felt something other than fear, a spark of determination. If their lives were tied together, then she wasn't going down without a fight. Sacrifice and revelation. The golden sands churned violently as the predators emerged, their sleek black forms slicing through the rippling terrain like shadows come to life. Their glowing green eyes locked onto Ilara and Adrix, and a low guttural growl reverberated through the air, sending a shiver down Ilara's spine. They're faster this time, Ilara muttered, her grip tightening around the shard of metal in her hand. Because of the bond, Adrix said, his voice strained but calm. It radiates energy. They can't resist it. Fantastic, she snapped, her heart pounding. Any other side effects I should know about before we die? Adrix didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, raising his hands as the air around him shimmered with raw energy. His golden eyes burned brighter, and his voice, low and steady, carried an unshakable resolve. Stay behind me. Ilara hesitated. She wanted to argue, to demand a better plan, but the urgency in his voice silenced her. She took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run, even though she knew there was nowhere to go. The predators circled them, their movements fluid and predatory, their claws carving deep grooves into the shimmering sand. They didn't attack immediately, as if savoring the moment, their glowing eyes fixed hungrily on the pair. Adrix, Ilara whispered, her voice tight with fear. We can't fight them like this. I can, he said, his tone unyielding. The energy around him flared, golden tendrils crackling in the air like lightning. The ground beneath his feet pulsed with light, and for a moment, the predators hesitated, their snarls turning into low, uncertain growls. What are you doing? Ilara asked, her voice rising. I'm ending this, Adrix replied. Ilara's stomach twisted. There was something in his tone. Finality. Wait, what do you mean ending this? You can't. He turned to her, his golden eyes softening for the briefest moment. This is the only way. The energy from the bond will destroy them, but it requires all of my strength. I cannot protect myself and you at the same time. No, Ilara said, shaking her head. There has to be another way. You don't have to. There isn't, Adrix interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. You must trust me, Ilara. This is the only way to keep you alive. Ilara's mind raced, her chest tightening as the realization hit her. He was going to sacrifice himself. The bond that tied them together meant she would feel his death, and the thought was unbearable. No, she said again, louder this time. I won't let you do this. The predators roared, their patience waning as they lunged toward them. Adrix raised his hands, and a brilliant burst of energy exploded outward, forcing them back. The sheer power of it made Ilara stumble, her ears ringing from the shockwave. Go, Adrix shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Run to the edge of the crossing and wait for the gateway to form. I'll hold them off. Ilara didn't move. She couldn't. If you die, I die, remember. She shouted back, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. The bond will break the moment they are destroyed, Adrix said, his voice softer now. You'll survive. That's what matters. Tears stung her eyes as she shook her head. You can't make this decision for me, Adrix. I won't let you. Before he could respond, the glowing mark on her arm flared brighter, pulsing in rhythm with the energy around him. It burned, but not painfully, more like a surge of power she didn't know she had. Ilara's eyes widened as realization struck. The bond, she murmured. It's not just a connection. It's a two-way street. What are you talking about? Adrix asked, his voice edged with urgency. I can give you my strength, she said, stepping closer. You don't have to do this alone. Adrix's expression shifted, a flicker of hope crossing his face, before he quickly shook his head. It's too dangerous. If you push too much energy into the bond, you'll... I'll survive, she interrupted. You said it yourself. The bond is a strength. So let's use it, together. The predators charged again, their roars deafening. But Ilara didn't flinch. She grabbed Adrix's arm, the mark on her skin blazing with golden light. A rush of energy surged through her, wild and untamed, but she didn't pull back. Adrix's eyes widened as the power flowed into him. Ilara, stop. No, she shouted, her voice fierce. We're doing this together. The predators leaped, their claws outstretched, but Adrix raised his hands, and this time, the energy that erupted from him was overwhelming. The golden light engulfed the creatures, their snarls turning into agonized screams as they were consumed. The ground trembled beneath them, the air vibrating with power. Ilara's vision blurred as the energy drained her, but she held on, refusing to let go. When the light finally faded, the predators were gone, and the golden sands were still once more. Ilara collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. Adrix knelt beside her, his breathing ragged but steady. He reached out, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. You're stubborn, he said, a faint smile on his lips. And you're reckless, she shot back, her voice weak but defiant. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they had just survived settling over them. You saved us, Adrix said finally, his voice softer now. No, Ilara replied, meeting his gaze. We saved each other. And for the first time, Adrix didn't argue. Desire beyond fear. Ilara awoke to warmth, a strange, soothing heat radiating through her body. She blinked against the dim light, the golden sky above her swirling with faint streaks of silver. The soft ground beneath her felt like fine sand, but it pulsed faintly, as if alive. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. Then she saw him. Adrix sat nearby, his back against a jagged rock, his golden eyes half closed, as if in meditation. His glowing armor, once battered and cracked, now hummed faintly with renewed energy. The mark on her arm, still faintly luminous, pulsed in sync with the faint light emanating from him. "You're awake," he said without looking at her. His voice was calm, steady, but there was an edge of weariness in it. "How long was I out?" Ilara asked, sitting up. Her body ached, but the overwhelming exhaustion she'd felt before was gone. "Long enough," he replied, finally turning his gaze to her. "The crossing stabilized while you rested. It gave us time to recover." She frowned, rubbing the glowing mark on her arm. "Recover from what exactly?" "That light show back there, or the fact that we're still tethered to each other like some cosmic chain gang." Edrix's lips twitched, almost a smile, but his eyes remained serious. "Both," he said simply. Ilara sighed, glancing around. The shimmering sands stretched endlessly, broken only by the faint outlines of distant cliffs. The air here felt lighter, yet the tension between them was palpable. "Okay," she said, breaking the silence. "We need to talk about this bond. I get that it's tied to survival and energy or whatever, but what happens now? Are we stuck like this forever?" Edrix's expression darkened, and for a moment, he didn't answer. Then he said, "The bond is not permanent, but severing it requires precision and risk." "Risk?" He nodded. "If it is broken improperly, it could destroy both of us." Ilara's stomach twisted. "Great. So we're stuck together until we figure that out." Adrix studied her, his golden eyes unreadable. "The bond is not entirely a curse," he said quietly. Ilara raised an eyebrow. "Oh really? Because it feels like one to me." He stood, his movements fluid despite the lingering strain on his body. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked, stepping closer. "The connection. It's not just fear or survival anymore. It's deeper." Ilara opened her mouth to retort, but the words died on her lips. He was right. She did feel it. An undeniable pull, a warmth that wasn't just hers. It was as if their shared moments, their struggles, had imprinted themselves on her soul. She hesitated, her voice faltering. "I don't know what I feel. Everything's been chaos since I met you." "And yet," Adrix said, his voice low, "you chose to fight with me. You didn't run. That wasn't the bond. That was you." Ilara's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to deny it, to push him away, but the truth was staring her in the face. She had trusted him, not just because of the bond, but because of who he was. She looked away, her fingers brushing the mark on her arm. "So what now?" she asked, her voice softer. Adrix stepped closer, his presence steady but not imposing. "We find the source of this bond," he said. "If we can understand it, we can control it, use it. And if we can't..." His golden eyes softened, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his face. "Then we keep moving forward, together." Ilara met his gaze, and for the first time, she didn't feel fear. There was still uncertainty, still doubt, but there was also something else, something stronger. "You're annoying," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "And you're stubborn," Adrix replied, his voice almost amused. They stood there for a moment, the tension between them shifting into something unspoken. The golden sands shimmered around them, the strange warmth of the crossing wrapping them in its quiet embrace. For the first time, Ilara felt like she wasn't alone. The bond was no longer just a burden. It was a connection, one she couldn't ignore. "Let's go," she said, breaking the silence. Adrix nodded, his gaze steady. "Together," he said. As they walked across the shimmering sands, the mark on her arm pulsed faintly, matching the rhythm of her steps. The road ahead was uncertain, but for now, Ilara knew one thing. Whatever lay ahead, she wouldn't face it alone.